The voicemail came in at 6:23 in the evening, right as the Christmas lights across the street blinked on for the first time that season. I was standing in my kitchen, rinsing a coffee mug I had forgotten to wash that morning, when my phone buzzed against the counter. I didn't look at it right away. I already knew who it would be. In my family, silence was never accidental. It was a strategy. The message was from my mother. Her voice sounded thin, stretched tight the way it always did when she was delivering bad news she had already justified to herself. "Helen, sweetheart," she said, "I need you to call me back tonight. It's about the will." The word will landed like a dropped plate. I turned off the faucet and leaned both hands against the counter, staring at my reflection in the dark window. I was 31 years old. I lived alone in a small townhouse outside Cedar Ridge, Illinois. I had no children, no husband, no backup income, and no appetite for family drama, or at least I thought I didn't. I called her back immediately. She answered on the second ring. "Oh, good," she said, relief flooding her voice. "I was worried you'd be upset." That was how she always started, preemptive innocence. "What about the will?" I asked. There was a pause, not a technical one, a calculated one. "Well," she said carefully, "your father and I finalized everything this afternoon. With the holidays coming, we thought it was best to have it settled. You know, just in case. Just in case, as if death were a snowstorm you prepared for with milk and bread." And I said, and she continued, "We made some decisions that we believe are fair, practical, for the family as a whole." My stomach tightened. I had learned a long time ago that when my mother used the word family, she rarely meant me. "Your brother will be inheriting the house," she said quickly, as if speed might soften the blow. "And the business interests. That makes sense since he's been involved for so long. The family business. My father's logistics company. The one I had helped stabilize during the recession quietly behind the scenes while my brother took credit for being visible." "And me?" I asked. Another pause. "Well," she said, "you're doing fine on your own, Helen. You always have been. Independent. Strong. We thought it would be better to support Mark's growing family. He has responsibilities now." I closed my eyes. Mark was 34. Divorced. 2 children he saw every other weekend. A man who had burned through money the way some people burned through apologies. Always promising to do better. Always forgiven. "What exactly am I inheriting?" I asked. She exhaled a sound halfway between a sigh and a defense. "There's a small trust," she said. "Enough to help with emergencies. And of course family heirlooms. Your grandmother's ring. Things like that." The ring. The one my grandmother had promised me when I was 14, sitting at her kitchen table shelling peas, while she told me I was the only one who ever really listened. So I said slowly, "The house, the company, the accounts, everything substantial goes to Mark. And I get a trust in jewelry." "It's not like that," my mother said sharply. "You're making it sound cruel." I laughed, a short humorless sound that surprised both of us. "No," I said, "I'm making it sound accurate." She bristled. I could hear it even through the phone. "You know," she said, "this is exactly why these decisions are so hard. You always take things personally. Mark understands family loyalty." There it was, the familiar sting, the unspoken accusation. I swallowed. "When did you decide this?" I asked. "This afternoon," she said. "Your father signed everything. The lawyer notarized it." This afternoon. The same afternoon, I had been called into a meeting at work and told with professional smiles that my role was being reevaluated, that my promotion had been delayed due to restructuring. I leaned against the counter, the cold seeping through my palms. "Did Dad agree with this?" I asked. "Of course," she said too quickly. "He wants harmony. He doesn't want anyone fighting after he's gone." I pictured my father as he had been lately, quieter, slower, letting my mother speak for him in rooms he used to dominate. "Did he say my name?" I asked. There was another pause. "He didn't object," she said. That was not an answer. I ended the call a few minutes later, my mother already shifting into reassurance mode, telling me it didn't mean they loved me less, telling me I could always come home for Christmas, telling me everything would work out. When the line went dead, I stood there in the dim kitchen, the blinking lights outside reflected in the glass like a faulty heartbeat. I wasn't shocked. That was the part that scared me. I had been expecting this my whole life. Ever since I was a child watching my parents rearrange plans to accommodate Mark. Ever since birthdays were forgotten and achievements were acknowledged with a nod instead of a celebration. Ever since I learned that being capable meant being convenient to overlook. I walked into my living room and sank onto the couch without turning on the lights. The voicemail notification was still on my screen, as if the universe wanted proof that this had actually happened. I thought about the company. The spreadsheets I had built for my father years ago, the systems I had helped streamline when Mark's decisions had nearly sunk the place, the advice I had given unpaid, uncredited, because I believed family meant something then. I thought about Christmas dinner, the way my mother would seat us. Mark at the head of the table beside Dad, me at the side smiling, passing dishes invisible. And I realized something else, something colder and sharper than hurt. This wasn't just inheritance. This was erasure. They weren't preparing for death. They were rewriting history. I stood up and walked to my desk. I opened my laptop not for comfort, but for clarity. If they thought this story was already written, they were wrong. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was done being the quiet one. And somewhere between the blinking Christmas lights and the unopened voicemail, a different kind of plan began to form. One that didn't involve asking for fairness. One that involved taking it. The next morning, the first thing I did was call in sick. Not because I was ill, but because I needed the quiet. The kind of quiet where thoughts stop ricocheting and start lining up. I sat at my dining table with a legal pad, the yellow paper glaringly blank. Outside Cedar Ridge was wrapped in that early winter stillness, the kind that makes everything look peaceful, even when it isn't. I poured coffee I barely tasted and stared at the steam curling upward, thinking about my mother's voice. Calm, certain, already absolved. I wrote one word at the top of the page. Excluded. I circled it once, then twice. I wasn't naive. I knew parents were allowed to do whatever they wanted with their money. Love wasn't a ledger. Fairness wasn't enforceable. That's what people always said. But this wasn't just about money. It was about a pattern so old it felt like muscle memory. I flipped to a fresh page and drew a line down the middle. On the left, I wrote facts. On the right, I wrote stories. Facts were concrete. Stories were the lies we told ourselves to survive. Fact, I had helped stabilize my father's company when Mark nearly ran it into the ground. Story, Mark was the natural successor. Fact, I had lived independently since college, paid my own way, never asked for help. Story, I didn't need support. Fact, Mark had been bailed out repeatedly. Story. He had responsibilities. I pressed the pen harder than necessary, the paper tearing slightly. Around noon, my phone buzzed. Mark. I stared at his name until the screen dimmed. Then I let it ring out. 5 minutes later, a text appeared. Mom said you're upset. You didn't have to hear it like that. Like what I typed then erased, I didn't respond. Instead, I called my Aunt Rachel. Rachel was my mother's older sister, a woman who had been politely sidelined from family decisions decades ago after divorcing a man my grandparents adored. She lived alone now by choice in a small house near the lake. She saw things clearly because she was no longer invested in being liked. She answered on the first ring. Hey, Helen, she said. I was wondering when you'd call. That alone told me everything. So you know, I said. Oh, I know, she replied. Your mother called me last night to tell me how relieved she was that everything was finally settled. Settled, another word that meant buried. What did Dad say? I asked. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Your father didn't call me, she said, which is unusual. When he avoids something, it's because he doesn't want to defend it. My jaw tightened. Do you think Mom pushed this? I asked. Rachel gave a soft, humorless laugh. Your mother has been rehearsing this outcome since Mark was born, she said. She just needed the paperwork to catch up. I closed my eyes. There's more, Rachel continued. I probably shouldn't say this, but I don't like secrets. I leaned forward. Your parents didn't just update the will, she said. They changed the ownership structure of the company last year. Quietly, Mark became majority holder. My chest went cold. When I asked, last spring, she said, around the time you told me you were helping them renegotiate their supplier contracts, the room seemed to tilt. That work, the cost-saving projections, the vendor restructuring, the exact changes that had increased profits just enough to justify the ownership shift. Rachel, I said slowly, did Dad sign it? Yes, she said. But he didn't read it. Your mother handled the lawyer. She always does. I thanked her and hung up my hands trembling. This wasn't neglect. This was extraction. They had used my work to strengthen the company, then locked me out of the future it created. I stood up and paced the living room, anger rising like a tide. I wanted to scream, to drive to my parents' house and demand explanations. I wanted to confront Mark, to ask him how he slept at night, knowing what he'd taken. But instinct told me that would be a mistake. Because people who believe they are entitled don't confess when confronted. They double down. I went back to the table and wrote another word beneath excluded. Invisible. Then I opened my laptop and logged into the old cloud folder I hadn't touched in years. The one labeled Dad Consulting. Inside were spreadsheets, emails, projections, time-stamped, archived, forgotten, receipts. I scrolled slowly, my pulse steadying with each file name. There was the supplier analysis that had saved the company nearly 7 figures annually. There was the contingency plan Mark had ignored until Dad forced him to implement it after a near collapse. There were emails where my father thanked me privately, promising we'd talk when things settled. Things had settled, just not in my favor. My phone buzzed again. A text from my mother. "I hope you'll still come for Christmas. Family is what matters most." I stared at the words until they blurred. Family. I thought about my grandmother again, about her quiet warnings, about the way she used to say, "Watch who benefits when no one is looking." I typed a reply, then deleted it. Instead, I opened a new document. I titled it Timeline. If this was a story they wanted to tell, I was going to make sure it included every chapter they tried to erase. I didn't know yet how it would end, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of being seen as difficult. I was afraid of staying silent, and silence, I had learned, was exactly how they got away with everything. I drove to my parents' house 3 days later, the Saturday before Christmas, when the roads were slick with half-frozen slush and the sky hung low and gray. I told myself I was going for answers, not a fight. That was a lie, but it was a useful one. Their house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, the same place we'd lived since I was 12. White siding, blue shutters, a wreath on the door that my mother changed every season like a ritual of control. Everything looked exactly the same, which somehow made what I was about to do feel worse. I sat in my car for a full minute after turning off the engine, my hands wrapped around the steering wheel. I reminded myself to breathe. I reminded myself that I wasn't a child anymore. I reminded myself that I was allowed to ask questions. When I rang the bell, my mother answered almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting behind the door. "Helen," she said brightly, "you should have called first." She stepped aside anyway, already performing hospitality. The house smelled like cinnamon and roasted meat. Christmas music played softly from the kitchen, normalcy as a weapon. My father was in his armchair, the television muted. He looked smaller than I remembered, his shoulders rounded, his hair more gray than white. He smiled when he saw me, but it didn't reach his eyes. "There's my girl," he said. I didn't correct him. I just kissed his cheek and sat across from him. Mark's car wasn't in the driveway, which meant this wasn't an ambush. That mattered. "I won't stay long," I said. "I just need to talk." My mother folded her arms loosely, already defensive. "If this is about the will, we really don't want to rehash." "It's about the company," I interrupted. The room went quiet. My father shifted in his chair. "What about it?" "I want to know when Mark became majority owner," I said. My mother inhaled sharply. "Rachel," she snapped the name a curse. I ignored her. I looked at my father. "Dad," I said, "when did you sign it?" He looked down at his hands. His fingers trembled slightly. "Last spring," he said quietly. "Did you read it?" I asked. He hesitated. That was answer enough. My mother stepped forward. "We did what made sense," she said. "Mark is here. He's invested. You left." I laughed. The sound startled all three of us. "I left," I said. "I live 40 minutes away. I worked nights for your company without pay. I fixed problems Mark created." "That was helping," she snapped. "That wasn't ownership." "That was value," I said, "and you monetized it." My father finally looked up at me. "Helen," he said, "your mother handles these things. I didn't want conflict." There it was, the sentence that had shaped my entire childhood. I didn't want conflict. "So you let her decide who mattered," I said softly. My mother's face hardened. "This is unfair." "No," I said, "it's accurate." She opened her mouth, then closed it. I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the rapid assessment of whether this conversation could still be steered. "Mark has children," she said finally. "You don't." I stared at her. "That's your justification?" I asked. "That I didn't reproduce on schedule." "That's not what I meant," she said, flustered. "It is," I replied. "You just said it politely." My father rubbed his temples. "What do you want, Helen?" The question hung in the air. I had thought about this, carefully. "I want transparency," I said. "I want copies of every document you signed last year. I want to know how my work factored into the valuation." My mother laughed sharp and dismissive. "You're not entitled to that." "I'm not asking as your daughter," I said. "I'm asking as a contributor." She scoffed. "You didn't have a contract." "No," I agreed, "but I have records." That caught her attention. "What records?" she asked. I stood up. Emails, files, timestamped documents, enough to show that the company's recent growth came directly from my input. My father looked alarmed. "Helen, what are you saying?" "I'm saying," I replied evenly, "that if this were any other business, what you did would be considered unethical." My mother crossed her arms. "Are you threatening us?" I considered that. "I'm clarifying reality," I said. "Threats come later." The silence stretched. The Christmas music continued, absurd and cheerful. My father spoke first. "We can revisit this after the holidays." "No," I said, "you can't." My mother's eyes narrowed. "You're being dramatic." "I'm being precise," I replied. "Mark has built his future on work he didn't do. You helped him do it, and now you expect me to smile and pass the potatoes." My father's voice cracked. What would you have us do? I looked at him, really looked. He wasn't a villain. He was a man who had chosen comfort over fairness again and again until the cost was unbearable. I would have you tell the truth, I said. To yourselves, at least. My mother laughed again, but this time it sounded hollow. Truth doesn't change legal documents. No, I agreed. But it changes what comes next. I picked up my coat. I'm not here to beg, I said. I'm here to inform you. My father stood unsteady. Helen, please, don't do anything rash. I met his eyes. I already did, I said. I stopped protecting you. I walked out into the cold, my heart pounding, my breath visible in the air. As I reached my car, my phone buzzed. A message from Mark. We need to talk. Mom says you're upset. I stared at the screen, then typed a single reply. We're past talking. As I drove away, I felt something unfamiliar settle into my chest. Not relief. Resolve. They had built a future by pretending I didn't exist. Now they were going to learn what happened when the invisible woman decided to be seen. Mark showed up at my door the following evening without warning. I knew it was him before I looked through the peephole. There was a particular way he knocked 3 uneven taps followed by a pause, as if he expected the door to open automatically out of habit. I didn't move right away. I sat on the edge of my couch listening to my own breathing, the quiet tick of the clock on the wall. I wasn't afraid. I was deciding. He knocked again, louder this time. Helen, he called. Come on. I stood and opened the door halfway, leaving the chain on. What do you want? I asked. He smiled, that familiar half grin that used to charm teachers and later bankers. It faltered when he saw my expression. Can I come in? He asked. No, I said. He blinked. Okay. Wow, straight to that. This isn't a social call, I replied. Say what you came to say. He sighed dramatically and leaned against the doorframe as if this were a scene he'd rehearsed. Mom's really upset. Dad, too. You kind of dropped a bomb. You dropped the bomb, I said. I just stopped standing under it. His jaw tightened. Look, I didn't ask for this. I laughed softly. You signed the papers. That was Mom's idea, he said quickly. You know how she is. You didn't say no, I replied. He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. You've always been good on your feet, I continued. You could have walked away. You didn't. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. What do you want me to do? Give it back. The sarcasm was instinctive, reflexive. I met his eyes. I want you to tell the truth. He snorted. About what? About how the company survived, I said. About who fixed your mistakes. About why profits suddenly jumped. That's ancient history, he scoffed. Everyone contributed. No, I said calmly. Everyone benefited. I contributed. He straightened, irritation creeping in. Why are you doing this now? Because I finally realized something, I thought. Out loud, I said, because you've been dining on my silence for years. His face hardened. You always make yourself the victim. I made myself invisible, I corrected. You took advantage. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. Be careful. You start poking around, you're going to hurt Mom. There it was, the threat disguised as concern. I'm not responsible for Mom's choices, I said. And neither are you, but you're accountable for yours. He stared at me, searching for leverage. You don't have standing. The company isn't yours. I know, I said, but the story is... He laughed, but it sounded forced. You think you're going to shame me? I think, I replied evenly, that the people who matter don't like surprises. He went still. What people, he asked. I smiled just slightly. The bank, the minority partners, the auditor who signed off on the valuation based on data I built. His eyes flickered. You wouldn't, he said. I already am, I replied. He stepped back as if the space between us had suddenly become dangerous. You're bluffing, he said. Then you have nothing to worry about, I answered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The hallway light buzzed overhead. Somewhere a neighbor's dog barked. You're really doing this, he said quietly. Yes, I said, and I want you to understand something before you leave. He waited. I'm not trying to take what's yours, I said. I'm trying to reclaim what you erased. He swallowed. Mom will never forgive you. I shrugged. She never noticed me enough to miss me. That landed harder than I expected. His face softened for just a second, then closed again. You've changed, he said. No, I replied. I stopped pretending. He turned and walked away without another word, his footsteps echoing down the hall. I closed the door and slid the chain back into place, my hands shaking now that the adrenaline had nowhere to go. I leaned my forehead against the door and let out a long breath. An hour later, my email pinged. A message from a firm I hadn't contacted in years. Subject inquiry regarding financial model authorship. My pulse quickened. The sender was a junior associate at the accounting firm that had audited my father's company during the ownership transition. Polite, neutral, curious. They wanted to understand the origin of certain projections used in last year's valuation. I stared at the screen, then opened my archive. I attached 3 files. Nothing dramatic, no accusations, just timestamps, authorship metadata, and one brief sentence in the body of the email. I am happy to clarify my role if needed. I hit send. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm. That night, I slept for the first time in days without replaying conversations in my head. The silence was different now. It wasn't empty. It was watchful. 2 days later, my mother called again. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail. "This has gone too far," she said, her voice tight. "Mark is under a lot of pressure. The bank has questions. You need to stop." I deleted the message without listening to the rest. Pressure. Good. That was the sound of the truth pressing back. I poured myself a glass of water and sat by the window watching the lights come on one by one across the neighborhood. I thought about the years I had spent shrinking, smoothing, accommodating. I thought about the way my family had mistaken my patience for permission. They were learning now, and this time I wasn't going to explain myself. I was going to let the system do what it always does when facts finally surface. I was going to let gravity take over, and gravity I had learned never needed to raise its voice to bring things down. The first crack appeared on Christmas Eve. I was in the grocery store standing in line with a basket of things I didn't need when my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't family. It was my father's bank. I stared at the caller ID until the cashier cleared her throat. I paid, walked out into the cold, and answered. "Ms. Walker," the voice said, formal and measured. "This is Thomas Hale from Northline Financial. I'm calling in regard to a recent inquiry involving Walker Freight Solutions." My heart didn't race, it slowed. "Yes," I said. "How can I help you?" There was a brief pause, the kind people use to confirm tone. "We're conducting a routine review following a change in ownership structure," he said. "Your name surfaced in connection with several financial models used during last year's valuation." I leaned against my car, the metal cold through my coat. "I'm not an owner," I said carefully, "but I authored those models." Another pause. "That's what we'd like to discuss," he said. "Would you be available for a brief call next week?" "Yes," I said, "I would." He thanked me and hung up. I stood there for a moment, my breath fogging the air, feeling something close to awe. Not at the bank, at the timing. Truth has its own calendar. Christmas Day came and went without me stepping foot in my parents' house. I sent a polite text in the morning. "Hope you're well. I'm staying in this year. Love you." My mother didn't reply until late afternoon. "This is breaking your father's heart." I didn't respond. That evening, I sat alone at my dining table, a single place, setting a glass of wine untouched. Snow fell softly outside, coating the street in a hush that felt almost sacred. I thought about my grandmother again, about the stories she used to tell me when I was young, stories about women who endured quietly until one day they didn't. I wondered if she would have been proud of me. On Monday morning, I received another message. This one from Mark. "We need to talk. This isn't funny anymore." I smiled despite myself. "Funny?" I waited an hour before replying. "Then maybe you should stop laughing." The call with the bank happened on Wednesday. I sat at my desk, a yellow legal pad beside me, my old files open on the screen. Thomas Hale was polite, precise. He asked about methodology, about assumptions, about authorship. I answered calmly, factually, without emotion. Yes, I created that projection. Yes, I shared it with my father and brother for internal use. No, I was not compensated. Yes, the valuation relied heavily on those numbers. He thanked me for my clarity. "We may need additional documentation," he said. "This is standard." "Of course," I replied. When the call ended, I sat back and closed my eyes. This was no longer about feelings. This was about records. 2 hours later, my mother called. I let it ring. She called again, then again. Finally, she left a voicemail. "Helen?" She said, her voice shaking now, the practiced composure cracking. "The bank is asking questions. Mark says you've been talking to them. You promised you weren't trying to hurt anyone." I played the message twice, then deleted it. I had never promised that. That night, I received an email from the family attorney. Subject clarification request. It was brief, carefully worded. He wanted to understand the scope of my involvement in the company's financial planning. He wanted to know if I had retained copies of any documents. I replied with equal restraint. "I have maintained personal records of my work as advised by counsel at the time." It wasn't a lie. I had advised myself. On Friday afternoon, my Aunt Rachel came over with a pie and a look I hadn't seen on her face in years. "They're panicking," she said, settling into my kitchen chair. "Your mother called me this morning." "What did she say?" I asked. "She asked if I thought you were trying to destroy the family," Rachel replied. I snorted, and I told her the family did a fine job of that without you. We laughed, a quiet conspiratorial sound. "Mark's ex-wife called me too," Rachel added. "She heard something through the kids' school about the business being reviewed." I raised an eyebrow. "She's not surprised," Rachel said. "Apparently Mark's financial genius has been a running joke for years." That night I slept deeply, dreamlessly. The following Monday, my father came to my house. I didn't hear him knock at first. I was in the shower, the water loud in my ears. When I came out, towel wrapped around me, I saw his car through the window. My stomach clenched. I dressed quickly and opened the door. He looked older than he had a week ago, smaller. His coat hung off his shoulders, his eyes rimmed red. "Helen," he said, "please." I stepped aside. He sat at my kitchen table, hands folded, staring at the wood grain. "I didn't know," he said finally. I leaned against the counter. "You didn't ask." He winced. "Your mother," he began. I held up a hand. "Don't." He nodded, swallowing. "The bank thinks the valuation may need to be revised," he said. "They're saying Mark's stake could change." I waited. "They asked me why your name wasn't included," he continued. I didn't have an answer. I met his eyes. "That's because the answer isn't flattering," I said. He nodded slowly. "I failed you," he said. The words hung between us, fragile and rare. "Yes," I replied. He flinched, then nodded again. "What do you want?" he asked. I took a breath. "I want acknowledgement," I said. "I want the truth reflected in the record. And I want you to stop letting Mom decide who deserves what." He looked down at his hands. "I don't know if I can fix everything," he said. "I'm not asking you to," I replied. "I'm asking you to stop making it worse." He left an hour later, shoulders slumped, his confidence stripped away. That evening, the email arrived. Subject: revised ownership review pending. It was from Northline Financial. The body was short. "Based on newly reviewed documentation, we are reassessing the distribution of equity in Walker Freight Solutions. All parties will be notified of next steps." I closed my laptop and sat in the quiet. The snow had stopped. The world felt suspended, waiting. This wasn't victory. Not yet. But the ground had shifted. And once it does, everything built on denial begins to crack. I poured myself another glass of wine and raised it alone to the truth. It didn't need defending anymore. It was finally being heard. The call came on a Thursday morning just after 9, when the light through my living room window had that pale, honest quality that makes everything feel exposed. It wasn't the bank this time. It was the attorney. "Ms. Walker," he said, his voice clipped, professional, carefully neutral. "We need to schedule a family meeting. Immediately." I almost laughed. Family meeting. As if this were about hurt feelings and not structural collapse. "I'm available," I said. There was a pause. "Your brother has retained separate counsel." That finally made my pulse jump. "Understood," I replied. We met the following afternoon in the attorney's office downtown, a space designed to feel impartial and intimidating at the same time. Gray carpet, glass walls, a conference table that reflected your face back at you if you leaned too close. I arrived 10 minutes early. Old habit. Preparation had always been my quiet advantage. Mark was already there when I walked in. He looked worse than I expected. Not disheveled exactly, but thinner, the sharp edge of stress carving away the ease he usually wore like cologne. He didn't look at me when I entered. His lawyer, a man with an aggressive haircut and a louder tie, did. My parents arrived together. My mother's lips were pressed into a single determined line. My father walked slowly as if each step required permission. The attorney cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "We're here to discuss recent findings related to the valuation of Walker Freight Solutions and the implications for ownership and estate planning." My mother jumped in immediately. "This is unnecessary," she said. "Everything was handled legally." The attorney nodded. "Legally, yes, but perhaps not completely." Mark's lawyer leaned forward. "My client relied on professional assessments." "As did the bank," the attorney replied calmly. "Which is precisely the issue." He turned to me. "Ms. Walker," he said, "can you summarize your role in the financial projections used last year?" I didn't look at Mark when I spoke. I looked at the table. "I created the models that projected operational efficiency and revenue growth," I said. "They were used to justify the ownership restructuring." "Were you compensated?" he asked. "No." "Were you credited?" "No." My mother scoffed. "She volunteered. We didn't ask." "You accepted," I said quietly. The room stilled. The attorney raised a hand. "Let's keep this factual." He slid a folder across the table toward my parents. "Based on new documentation," he continued, "the bank has determined that the valuation was materially influenced by Ms. Walker's work. As such, the ownership transfer may be subject to revision." Mark slammed his hand on the table. "This is insane." His lawyer put a hand on his arm, but Mark shook it off. "She's doing this to punish us," he snapped, finally looking at me. "She's always been resentful." I met his gaze. "I'm doing this because facts don't disappear just because you ignore them," I said. My mother leaned forward, eyes blazing. "You're tearing this family apart." "No," I said. "I'm telling the truth. The tearing happened years ago." My father spoke, then his voice hoarse. "Mark," he said, "let her finish." Mark stared at him as if he'd been betrayed by gravity itself. The attorney continued. "One potential resolution," he said, "would involve recognizing Ms. Walker as a contributing stakeholder during the period in question. This could take the form of retroactive compensation or equity adjustment." My mother's head snapped up. Absolutely not. The attorney didn't flinch. Alternatively, the bank may require a full revaluation, which could significantly alter current ownership percentages. Mark went pale. What does that mean? He demanded. It means the attorney said your majority stake may not hold. Silence fell heavy and thick. I watched Mark's jaw tighten, his eyes darting, calculating. This was the moment when entitlement met reality, and reality didn't blink. This is extortion, my mother hissed. It's accounting, the attorney replied. My father closed his eyes. I never wanted this, he said softly. I turned to him. I know, I said, but wanting peace doesn't create it. The meeting ended without resolution. The attorneys agreed to draft proposals. Everyone stood up stiffly as if gravity had suddenly increased. Mark stopped me at the door. You think this makes you righteous? He said under his breath. You think you've won? I looked at him. I think you've finally been forced to play fair, I said. That's all. He laughed bitterly. You don't understand what you're doing. I held the door open. I understand exactly what I'm doing, I replied. I'm refusing to disappear. That night, my mother sent me a long email. It was part accusation, part confession, part justification. She wrote about sacrifice, about loyalty, about how difficult it was to raise a son who needed so much more than a daughter who needed so little. She wrote about fear, about losing control, about believing that keeping the peace required choosing sides. I read it once, then I archived it. I didn't reply. 2 days later, the bank sent formal notice. A revaluation was underway. Markets hate uncertainty. Family businesses hate it more. The following week was a blur of calls, emails, documents. Mark's lawyer grew quieter. My parents grew smaller. The truth expanded to fill every corner they had once tried to keep dark. On Sunday evening, my father called. Can we meet? He asked. Just us, I agreed. We sat on a bench by the frozen lake near Rachel's house, bundled against the cold. The ice creaked faintly beneath the surface, a reminder of how things can seem solid until they aren't. I should have protected you, he said. I watched the sky darken. I should have protected myself, I replied. You taught me how not to. He nodded, tears welling. I'm proud of you, he said. The words came too late to heal the past, but not too late to matter. As I drove home, my phone buzzed. A message from the bank. Preliminary findings indicate material misattribution of intellectual contribution. Further adjustments forthcoming. I pulled into my driveway and sat there for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled. This wasn't revenge. Not yet. This was reckoning. And reckoning, I had learned, was quieter than rage. It arrived not with fire, but with paperwork. And once it began, it did not stop until everything was finally irrevocably accounted for. The first apology came in the form of a voicemail Mark never intended me to keep. It arrived late Sunday night, just after 10, when people call because they believe exhaustion makes them sound sincere. Helen, he said, his voice low, strained. I'm just calling to say, this has gone further than I expected. I think we all made mistakes, Mom too. Maybe we can find a way to move forward without destroying everything. Destroying everything. I listened to it twice, then I saved it. Because apologies that arrive only after leverage are not remorse, they are strategy. The bank's revaluation process moved faster than anyone anticipated. Family businesses often rely on reputation as collateral, and once questions start circulating, urgency replaces denial. By midweek, the auditors requested a formal interview with me. This time they didn't ask what I felt. They asked what I could prove. I sat in a glass-walled conference room with 2 analysts and 1 senior partner. They had thick folders. I had a slim laptop and a calm I didn't recognize as my own. Walk us through the sequence, one of them said. So I did. I explained how Mark's early decisions created inefficiencies, how I identified them, how I built projections to correct them, how those projections were later used to justify ownership changes without my knowledge or consent. I didn't editorialize. I didn't accuse. I simply told the truth in chronological order. The senior partner leaned back near the end. You understand, he said, that this will have consequences. Yes, I replied. Not just financial, he added, relational. I thought of my mother's email, of my father's silence, of Mark's voicemail. I understand, I said again. When the meeting ended, one of the analysts walked me to the elevator. For what it's worth, she said quietly, this happens more than people think. You're handling it well. I smiled thinly. I've had practice being overlooked. That night, my mother showed up at my door. No warning, no call. I opened it and found her standing there with a purse clutched tightly against her side, her posture rigid with purpose. I need to talk to you, she said. I stepped aside. She didn't sit. She paced my living room, eyes scanning as if searching for something she'd misplaced. "You've embarrassed us," she said finally. I leaned against the wall. "That's your opening." She stopped pacing. "You could have come to us, privately." "I did," I said, "for years. You just didn't listen." Her face tightened. This didn't need to involve outsiders. "It already did," I replied. "When you involved the bank." She looked at me, then really looked as if seeing a stranger. "I don't understand why you're doing this," she said. "What do you want?" The question echoed the one my father had asked, but it sounded different coming from her. Less curious, more defensive. "I want accountability," I said, "and acknowledgement." She scoffed. "You want punishment?" I shook my head. "I want correction." She stared at me incredulous. "Mark could lose everything." "He didn't earn it," I said. Her voice rose. "He is my son." "So am I," said quietly. The words hung there awkward and undeniable. She blinked, then turned away. "You've always been cold." I laughed softly. "I learned from you." She left without another word. The following Friday, the bank issued preliminary findings to all stakeholders. The email was clinical, careful, devastating. Based on reassessment, the ownership transfer conducted last year did not accurately reflect individual contributions to enterprise value creation. Adjustments will be recommended. Mark called within minutes. "This is insane," he shouted. "You're ruining us." "I didn't write the report," I said calmly. "I just answered questions." "You could stop this," he pleaded. "Tell them it was informal, that it doesn't matter." I closed my eyes. "You're still asking me to lie," I said. "That's why this is happening." He went silent. "You know," I continued, "I spent my whole life thinking if I were just patient enough, helpful enough, you'd eventually see me as an equal." He didn't respond. "I don't need that anymore," I said. "But you do need to face what you took." He hung up. The retaliation began quietly. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years unfriended me on social media. A family friend stopped returning my messages. My mother's church acquaintances sent polite but distant notes. I felt it like a slow frost creeping in from the edges. Isolation is the oldest punishment. But something else happened too. My Aunt Rachel called. "I'm proud of you," she said. "You're breaking a pattern." A former employee of my father's company reached out thanking me for finally saying what everyone knew. Even my father began calling more often, his voice softer, less guarded. "I should have done this," he said once. "You couldn't," I replied. "It had to be me." The official recommendation arrived 2 weeks later. Mark's majority stake would be reduced. A trust would be established recognizing my contribution retroactively, compensating me and granting limited equity oversight. It wasn't justice, but it was correction. Mark didn't speak to me for a month. When he finally did, it was brief. "I didn't think you'd go this far," he said. "I didn't think you'd push me to," I replied. We haven't spoken since. Christmas came and went quietly that year. No invitations, no forced smiles. I spent it with Rachel eating soup and watching the lake freeze solid under a pale winter sun. As the year turned, I realized something unexpected. The anger had burned itself out. What remained was clarity. I hadn't done this to punish them. I had done it to stop the lie. And once the lie was exposed, it no longer owned me. That was the real inheritance. Not money, not property, but the freedom that comes from refusing to carry what was never yours to begin with. The silence after the revaluation was louder than any argument we had ever had. It wasn't just that Mark stopped calling. It was that the family ecosystem adjusted itself around my absence with eerie efficiency. Group chats went quiet. Holiday plans were suddenly still forming. Photos appeared online of dinners I hadn't been invited to, captions carefully neutral, as if omission were accidental. I had been excluded before. This time it was intentional. What surprised me wasn't the loss. It was how quickly my body adapted to the absence of tension. I slept better. I stopped bracing myself before checking my phone. The low-grade anxiety I had carried since childhood began to lift like pressure, equalizing after years underwater. Then, just as I started to believe the worst was over, the second front opened. It began at work. I had been with Kessler & Rowe Consulting for almost 4 years. Mid-sized firm, stable clients, predictable rhythm. I wasn't flashy, but I was reliable, which in my industry mattered more, or so I thought. On a Tuesday afternoon, my manager, Denise, asked me to step into her office. She didn't close the door. That should have been my first clue. "Helen," she said, folding her hands on the desk. "I wanted to check in. There's been some feedback." I waited. "A few people have mentioned you seem distracted lately." I blinked. "Distracted how?" "Less collaborative," she said, a bit guarded. I almost laughed. "Is my work suffering?" I asked. She hesitated. "No. Your deliverables are solid, as always." "Then what's the issue?" I pressed. She smiled tightly. Perception. There it was again. That word. The one used when facts aren't enough. "Is this about my family situation?" I asked. Her eyes flickered. "We don't pry into personal matters," she said quickly. But when external conflicts begin to affect team dynamics, they don't, I interrupted. I don't discuss my family here. She leaned back, exhaling. Look, I just want to make sure nothing complicated follows you. Complicated. I nodded slowly. Are you concerned about reputational risk? She didn't answer right away. We had a call, she said finally, from a mutual contact. My chest tightened. Who? She cleared her throat. Your brother's attorney reached out. Casually. He asked whether you'd been under any unusual stress lately. The room went very still. He contacted my employer, I said. Yes, Denise said, off the record. I felt something shift inside me, not fear, recognition. So this is retaliation, I said calmly. Denise's eyes widened. No one said that. You didn't have to, I replied. Did he suggest I was unstable? She didn't deny it. I stood up. Thank you for telling me, I said. I'll make sure legal is aware. Her mouth opened. Helen, I don't think... I do, I said, very clearly. I walked back to my desk, my hands steady, my mind already moving. Mark had crossed a line. Not morally, strategically. That night I didn't call Rachel. I didn't vent, I didn't pace. I opened a new document. Title interference. I listed dates, times, names, the voicemail apology, the bank inquiry, the attorney call, the contact with my employer. Patterns don't lie. The next morning I scheduled a consultation with an employment attorney. Her name was Laura Bennett, late 50s, sharp eyes, no wasted words. She listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting something down. When I finished, she leaned back. This is classic intimidation by proxy, she said. He's trying to make you feel unsafe everywhere. Can he do that, I asked. He can try, she replied, but he's sloppy. I raised an eyebrow. He involved your workplace, she continued. That exposes him, especially given the ongoing financial review. What do we do, I asked. She smiled thinly. We document, then we notify. Within 48 hours, Mark's attorney received a formal letter. Cease and desist. No more third-party contact. No more character insinuations. All communication routed through counsel. The response came fast. A denial, of course. Then something else happened. My phone buzzed with an unknown number. I answered. Ms. Walker, a man said. This is Samuel Price. I represent the minority partners of Walker Freight Solutions. I sat down slowly. Yes, I said. How can I help you? We've been reviewing the bank's findings, he said. There are concerns. About the valuation, I said. And governance, he added. Specifically about how certain decisions were made without full disclosure. I closed my eyes. What are you asking, I said. We'd like your cooperation, he replied. Informally for now. The walls were closing in on Mark from directions he hadn't anticipated. Family had been manageable. Banks had been survivable. Partners were different. They had money at stake and no patience for sentiment. That evening, Mark called again. This time his voice was different. Not angry. Afraid. They're coming after me, he said. You need to help me fix this. I laughed quietly. You still don't understand. Please, he said. If the partners force a vote, you should talk to your lawyer, I said. You know more than they do, he snapped. You always did. There it was, the truth slipping out unguarded. You made this mess, I said. You don't get to outsource the cleanup. You're enjoying this, he accused. I thought about that. No, I said honestly, I'm finished with it. I hung up. 2 days later, Denise called me back into her office. This time the door was closed. I owe you an apology, she said. We received clarification. I waited. Your brother's attorney contacted us again, she continued. We declined to engage. Legal advised us to document the attempt. I nodded. We value your work, she said, and your professionalism. I know, I replied. When I left her office, I felt something loosen in my chest. Mark's tactics were unraveling, not because I fought harder, but because I stopped absorbing the damage quietly. By the end of the week, the minority partners had formally requested a governance review. Mark was suspended from decision-making pending the outcome. My mother called once more. Her voice was subdued. This has gone too far, she said. No, I replied. This is exactly how far it was always going to go. She didn't argue. For the first time, she sounded tired instead of righteous. I ended the call gently. That night, I sat alone on my couch, the city lights glowing outside my window. I thought about revenge, how people imagine it as loud, dramatic, satisfying in a cinematic way. But real revenge isn't about destruction. It's about withdrawal, about stepping out of the role that allowed someone else to use you. Mark had built his power on my silence. Once I took it back, everything else followed. And I realized something else, something quietly profound. I wasn't punishing him. I was letting consequences finish the work he had started. That was the difference. That was the shift. And it was irreversible. The partners moved faster than I expected. Once money is threatened, patience disappears. The governance review that was supposed to take weeks compressed into days. Emails multiplied, conference calls stacked, language sharpened. Where family conversations had been vague and emotional, the partners spoke in clean, ruthless terms. Risk exposure, fiduciary breach, material misrepresentation, words that do not care who raised whom. On a Thursday morning, I received a formal request to provide a sworn statement. Not a conversation. A statement. I took the day off work, drove to Laura Bennett's office, and sat across from her at a long table scattered with yellow pads and neatly clipped files. "This is where it stops being personal," she said, tapping the folder. "From here on, everything is on record." I nodded. I felt ready. We went line by line, dates, decisions, communications. I described how projections were presented, how my authorship was omitted, how ownership shifted immediately after the valuation spike. Laura stopped me once. "Don't explain motives," she said, "just actions." That was harder than it sounded, but I did it. When I signed the statement, my hand didn't shake. That surprised me. 2 days later, the partners suspended Mark entirely. Not temporarily, indefinitely. The announcement came in a neutral internal memo, but the subtext was unmistakable. Authority removed, access revoked, oversight installed. Mark called me that night, his voice unraveling. "They're freezing my accounts," he said. "They're saying I misled them." I listened. "They're saying you misled them," I replied. "You could tell them this wasn't intentional," he said desperately. "That I didn't know what I was signing." I closed my eyes. "You were the one who insisted on control," I said. "You don't get ignorance and power at the same time." He was quiet. "I never thought you'd do this," he whispered. I opened my eyes and stared at the dark window. "I never thought you'd force me to," I said. He hung up without another word. The fallout reached my parents quickly. My father showed up at my door again, but this time he didn't sit down. He stood in my kitchen like a guest who knew he'd overstayed his welcome years ago. "Your mother is sick with worry," he said. I folded my arms. "Is she worried about Mark or about how this looks?" He flinched. "The partners are talking about selling," he continued, "breaking the company apart." "That's their right," I said. He rubbed his face. "Everything we built." "You built it," I corrected. "Mark leveraged it. I stabilized it." He looked at me, then really looked, and something shifted. "I was wrong," he said, "about you." The words landed differently this time. Not like a bomb, like a ledger finally balanced. "I know," I said. He swallowed. "What happens now?" I exhaled slowly. "Now," I said, "the truth does what it always does. It spreads." The partners' attorneys reached out again, this time formally. They wanted my continued cooperation. They wanted to know if I would consider a role as an external advisor during the transition. I read the email twice. Then I declined. Not angrily, not dramatically. Just no. I wasn't interested in inheriting the wreckage. My work phone buzzed with a message from Denise. "Just wanted you to know we've received inquiries. We're backing you." I typed back a simple reply. "Thank you." The next escalation came from an unexpected direction. My mother's church. I was standing in my kitchen on Sunday morning when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw 2 familiar faces. Women I had known since childhood. Polite, concerned, armed with smiles that asked questions without asking them. I opened the door. "Helen," one of them said gently, "we just wanted to check on you." I nodded. "I'm fine." They exchanged a glance. "Your mother is very distressed," the other said. "We thought perhaps reconciliation." "This is not a spiritual matter," I said calmly. "It's a financial and ethical one." Their smiles faltered. "We just hope you're not acting out of bitterness," the first said. I looked at her. "I'm acting out of documentation," I replied. They left shortly after, their concern evaporating once it wasn't rewarded with submission. That afternoon, my mother sent me one last message. "You've made your point. Please stop." I read it slowly. Then I replied, "This isn't about making a point. It's about correcting a record. You taught me to stand by my choices. I'm doing that." She didn't answer. The partners released their findings the following Wednesday. Mark had breached fiduciary duty. The ownership transfer was voided. The company would be restructured under external leadership. My name appeared in the appendix. Contributor, architect, independent analyst. It wasn't flashy, but it was permanent. Mark didn't contest the findings. He couldn't. Without allies, without leverage, without my silence to cushion his fall, he was exposed. I heard later that he'd moved out of state, that he was consulting, that he told people his sister had turned on him. I didn't correct the narrative. People who listened carefully heard the rest. The strangest part came a week later. I felt empty. Not hollow, complete. The conflict that had fueled me for months was gone, replaced by a quiet I hadn't known before. I realized then that revenge isn't the explosion. It's the aftermath. It's waking up without rehearsing arguments. It's realizing you don't need their acknowledgement anymore, because the system did it for you. On a Friday evening, I sat on Rachel's porch watching the sun dip behind the lake. "You okay?" she asked. "I think so," I said. She smiled. "You broke the cycle." I thought about that. About how many women in my family had learned to swallow smooth sacrifice. About how easily silence had been confused with virtue. I didn't break it, I said. I stepped out of it. She raised her glass. To stepping out, she said. I raised mine. As the light faded, I felt something settle into place. Not triumph, not bitterness. Ownership of my story. And for the first time, it felt like enough. The quiet after everything collapsed was unfamiliar. Not peaceful, not yet. It was the kind of quiet that follows a long illness when the fever breaks, but the body hasn't learned how to rest again. I woke up every morning expecting another call, another escalation, another demand that I explain myself. None came. The company moved on without Mark. The partners installed interim leadership. Press releases spoke of strategic restructuring and renewed transparency. My name never appeared publicly, and that was fine. The truth didn't need applause to be real. What unsettled me was what came next. Choice. For most of my life, my decisions had been reactions, adjustments, corrections to someone else's plans. Even my rebellion had been framed by what my family did first. Now there was nothing to push against. I went to work, finished projects, attended meetings. People treated me the same, but I wasn't. The old instinct to minimize myself had dulled. When I spoke, I didn't soften my language. When I disagreed, I didn't apologize first. Denise noticed. You seem lighter, she said one afternoon, leaning against my cubicle wall. Sharper. I smiled. I stopped carrying what wasn't mine. She nodded slowly. That tracks. 2 weeks later, an email landed in my inbox that I hadn't anticipated. From Mark. Subject, I need to say this. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit there while I finished my workday, while I made dinner, while I washed dishes. I wanted to read it without adrenaline. When I finally did, the words were plain. No accusations, no threats. He wrote that he was angry, that he felt betrayed, that he also felt ashamed, that he hadn't realized how much he relied on me until I wasn't there to absorb the consequences. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked for understanding. I read it twice, then I closed the message. Some letters don't require answers. My mother didn't write again. But my father did. A handwritten note arrived in the mail, the envelope familiar, the handwriting slightly shaky. He wrote that he was stepping back from day-to-day decisions, that he was tired, that he was proud of me, that he wished he had been braver sooner. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. It didn't erase anything, but it mattered. Around that time, Laura Bennett called. The partners wanted to know if you'd reconsider an advisory role, she said. They're struggling. I looked out my window at the street below, people moving through their lives without knowing how fragile structures could be. No, I said, I'm done cleaning up other people's messes. She laughed softly. I thought you might say that. What happens now, I asked. She paused. Now you live. That sounded almost ridiculous. But she was right. I started saying no to things that drained me. I stopped attending events out of obligation. I took a week off work and went to the coast alone, walking the shoreline in the cold, letting the wind scrape the last of the anger out of me. On the final day of that trip, I sat on a bench overlooking the water and thought about inheritance. Not money, not property, but patterns. I had inherited silence from the women before me. I had inherited endurance, adaptability, emotional labor disguised as love, and I had chosen to stop passing it on. When I returned home, Rachel invited me over for dinner. She cooked too much food as always. You know, she said, pouring wine, your grandmother would have adored this version of you. I smiled. She planted it. Rachel nodded. And you grew it. A month later, my mother finally called again. Her voice was quieter now, older. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said. I just wanted you to know. I see it now. I didn't rush to respond. That's good, I said eventually. She exhaled. I don't know how to fix what I did. You don't, I replied gently. You just stop doing it again. She was quiet. Will you come for Thanksgiving, she asked. I thought about it. Not the holiday. The dynamic. I don't know yet, I said. I'll decide when it's closer. She accepted that. That too was new. As autumn deepened, I noticed something else. People began coming to me. Colleagues asking for advice, younger women asking how to speak up without burning bridges, even men uncertain, curious about how I navigated conflict without imploding. I didn't give speeches. I told stories about documentation, about boundaries, about what happens when you stop confusing peace with silence. One afternoon, a junior analyst lingered after a meeting. How did you know when to push back, she asked. I considered the question. I didn't, I said. I knew when I couldn't stay quiet anymore. That felt honest. The truth is I didn't win because I was brave. I won because staying small became unbearable. That's what people misunderstand about revenge. It isn't driven by rage. It's driven by clarity. By the moment you realize the cost of silence is higher than the cost of speaking. As winter approached again, the cycle nearly complete, I felt something settle. Not closure, integration. The story no longer ran me. I carried it, but it didn't carry me. And that, I realized, was the real transformation. Not vengeance, not vindication. Freedom. The quiet kind. The kind that stays. The call came on a Tuesday evening just after dinner, when the light outside had softened into that pale winter blue that makes everything look suspended between days. I almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar, but something in my chest tightened before the voicemail could pick up. Instinct isn't mystical, it's memory learning how to speak. "This is Evelyn Carter," the voice said when I answered. "I'm calling about the Hawthorne Trust." I sat down. The Hawthorne Trust was a name I hadn't heard spoken aloud in years. It lived in old paperwork in the footnotes of family conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered a room. "Yes," I said carefully. "This is Evelyn." There was a pause, professional but measured. "I represent the estate of Margaret Hawthorne, my grandmother. She passed away 3 months ago," the woman continued. "Her will names you as a beneficiary. We've been unable to reach you through prior channels." The room felt suddenly smaller. "My mother would have received notice," I said. "Yes," the lawyer replied. "She declined to forward it." "That landed exactly where it was meant to." "I see," I said. The lawyer cleared her throat. "There are matters that require your presence, specifically a deferred clause that becomes active only upon your acknowledgement." I closed my eyes. Deferred clause. Grandmother never did anything without intention. When I asked, "Thursday morning," she said, "my office." I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell Mark. I didn't even tell Rachel until the night before, and she just nodded once and said, "Of course she did." The law office sat in a quiet brick building downtown, the kind with brass fixtures and thick doors that close softly but firmly. The lawyer, Miss Carter, was older, her posture straight, her voice precise without being cold. She laid out the documents without drama. "Your grandmother established a trust years ago," she explained. "It was structured to activate in stages. The first disbursements were modest and directed toward your mother and siblings. The final portion was withheld." "Withheld for what?" I asked. "For proof," she said simply. She slid a document toward me. A letter. My grandmother's handwriting was unmistakable. Slanted, slightly right firm pressure, no wasted words. "Evelyn, if you are reading this, it means you have learned what it costs to be quiet. I have watched this family reward obedience and punish clarity. I stayed longer than I should have. I regret that, but I did not stay blind. I left you something they could not take." I read on my throat tightening. The trust contained assets my grandmother had accumulated quietly. Shares she never discussed. Property sold before anyone noticed. Money that never touched the family accounts. And she had placed conditions. The final disbursement could not be claimed if I reconciled financially with my mother. It could not be accessed if I agreed to any settlement that required silence about my termination. It could not be used to support family businesses. It was in every sense an inheritance designed to protect autonomy. "She anticipated resistance," Ms. Carter said gently. "Your grandmother instructed me to say this. The money is not a gift. It is leverage. Use it accordingly." I didn't cry. I laughed, a quiet, disbelieving sound that startled even me. Of course she had known. Of course she had seen it coming before I did. The sum was substantial, not obscene, but enough to change trajectory, enough to buy time options insulation, enough to never again confuse survival with loyalty. When I left the building, my phone was buzzing. My mother. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail. Her voice was sharp, frantic. "You went behind my back. The lawyer called me. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Yes, I did. I had honored the one woman in that family who had understood the cost of silence. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window. The city hummed below, unaware that something old had finally shifted. The next morning, my mother showed up at my door, unannounced, uninvited. Her eyes were bright with a familiar fury, but beneath it was something new, fear. "She never trusted you," she said before I could speak. "She was manipulating you." I leaned against the doorframe. She trusted me to survive. "That money belongs to the family," my mother snapped. "No," I said calmly. "It belongs to the person she chose." "You're tearing us apart," she said, voice cracking. I held her gaze. "We were already broken," I replied. "I just stopped pretending." She stared at me as if seeing a stranger. "Is this revenge?" she asked. I shook my head. "This is insulation," I said, "so I don't have to choose between dignity and security ever again." She left without another word. That afternoon, Mark texted, "I heard about your grandmother. We should talk." I deleted the message. Not every door needs closure. In the days that followed, I began making plans not fueled by urgency but by possibility. I reduced my work hours. I consulted selectively. I enrolled in a program I had postponed for years because it wasn't practical. I invested in things that wouldn't perform for anyone but me. One evening, Denise joined me for dinner. "You look Settled, she said. I am, I replied. She raised an eyebrow. What changed? I stopped waiting for permission, I said. She clinked her glass against mine. That'll do it. Weeks later, the trust finalized. The funds transferred quietly. No announcements, no celebration, just a shift in gravity. I donated a portion anonymously. I funded a scholarship in my grandmother's name for women leaving family businesses they were expected to serve without ownership. I kept the rest. Not out of greed, out of respect. My grandmother hadn't given me money. She had given me margin. As the year edged toward its close, invitations began to arrive. Holiday dinners, apologies wrapped in nostalgia, attempts at re-entry. I declined most. On Christmas morning, I woke alone, made coffee, and opened my grandmother's letter one last time. At the bottom, in smaller script, she had added a final line. Break the pattern. That is the only inheritance that matters. I folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. The cycle was ending, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the brittle, watchful silence of family dinners, where everyone is calculating what not to say. Not the tense quiet of conference rooms before bad news. This was different. It was mine. I woke up on the last Monday of the year without an alarm. Pale winter light filtered through the curtains, soft and unhurried. For the first time in as long as I could remember, there was nothing I was late for. Nothing I was bracing against. I made coffee and stood barefoot in the kitchen, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic, ordinary sounds, grounding sounds. A year ago, I would have mistaken this stillness for emptiness. Now I recognized it as space. My phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Rachel. You still on for dinner tonight? No family drama allowed. I smiled and typed back, yes, I'll bring dessert. That was the shape of my life now. Invitations without obligation. Choices without guilt attached. Later that morning, I sat at my desk and reviewed the final paperwork from the trust. Everything was complete, clean, closed. My grandmother's voice felt present in the margins, not haunting, but steady. She had not rescued me. She had believed I would rescue myself. That mattered. Around noon, I took a walk through the neighborhood. Christmas decorations were coming down wreaths, wilting lights unplugged. The season of performance was over. What remained was reality. At the corner, I ran into Mrs. Klein from 2 houses down. She was walking her dog bundled up in a scarf that looked older than both of us. Haven't seen your family around lately, she said casually. I nodded. We're redefining things. She smiled knowingly. Good for you. Not everyone gets there. That stuck with me. Not everyone gets there. Getting there required losing something first. The illusion of harmony, the false safety of compliance, the hope that if you endured long enough, someone would notice and reward you. They rarely do. That afternoon, my mother called again. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was calmer this time. No accusations, no panic. I've been thinking, she said, about your grandmother, about you. Maybe I got some things wrong. I didn't feel triumph. I felt distance. Not coldness, not cruelty. Perspective. I wasn't waiting for her to catch up anymore. I played the message once, then I archived it. If reconciliation came, it would be slow and mutual, not purchased with silence or money, not brokered by guilt. That evening at Rachel's apartment, the table was crowded with friends, mismatched plates, laughter that didn't pause when someone entered the room. No one asked me to explain myself. No one needed proof of my worth. At some point, Rachel raised a glass. To Evelyn, she said, for choosing herself, finally. I felt heat rise behind my eyes, but I didn't cry. I had already done my grieving. This was something else. Later, walking home through the cold, I thought about revenge. People imagine revenge as destruction, as public humiliation, as watching someone else fall the way you did. That isn't what happened. I didn't ruin anyone. I removed myself from the system that thrived on my silence. I exposed truth where lies needed darkness to survive. And I built a life where their approval was irrelevant. That kind of revenge doesn't leave rubble. It leaves absence. In January, I started a new project. My own. Small at first. Consulting work focused on ethical governance documentation and accountability. The kind of work that protects people before damage becomes inevitable. Women found me, quietly at first. Emails that began with, I don't know if this is relevant, but stories poured in. Familiar patterns, family businesses, offices run like monarchies, credit erased, boundaries punished. I listened. I didn't promise salvation. I offered tools, and sometimes that was enough. One afternoon, months later, I received a message from a woman in another state. Your story sounded like mine. I thought I was alone. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I replied, you weren't alone. You were just surrounded by people who needed you to believe you were. Spring came early that year. Crocuses pushed through stubborn soil. The world renewed itself without asking permission. On the anniversary of my termination, I took the day off and drove to the coast, the same shoreline I had walked when everything was still raw. I sat on the same bench wrapped in a coat, watching the waves crash and retreat. A year ago I had been angry. Before that I had been obedient. Now I was something else entirely. Whole. I thought about my grandmother, about the women before her, about how many had survived by shrinking. I hadn't fixed the past, but I had interrupted it. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, I felt no need to document this moment. No screenshots, no evidence. Some truths don't need receipts. They live in how you stand, how you speak, how you leave rooms without apologizing. I stood brushed sand from my gloves and turned back toward the road. Tomorrow would come with its own problems, but they would be mine. And that finally was enough. Thank you for listening to this story. If it resonated with you, if you've ever been excluded, underestimated, or asked to stay quiet to keep the peace, know this: your voice matters, your work matters, and silence is never the price of belonging. If you'd like, leave a comment sharing where you're listening from or the part of the story that stayed with you. And if you want more stories about justice, karma, and quiet revenge, subscribe to the channel and join us again. Until next time, stay strong and keep your receipts.